Welcome to our last Armchair conversation, Multilateralism Under Pressure, that will be moderated by Hugo Brady, Senior Strategic Advisor at ICMPD. Hugo, welcome.
Thank you, everybody. I know everyone is tired after a day and a half, so we're going to make this as conversational and as interactive as possible. I am no longer Malin Frankenhauser, the Director of Research Policy and Strategy. I was demoted overnight for my bad behavior at this conference, and too much lobbying for ICMPD, too many bilaterals, too many glasses of wine. So I'm right back to being strategic advisor again. In fact, it's a real pity that Malin isn't well enough to be here, because she, ever since I joined ICMPD, she always wanted to have someone from International Crisis Group on this platform. So it's ironic that we finally get you, and I'm very glad to say it's my good friend of a long time, Richard Gowan, who is the head of UN and multilateral issues for Crisis Group and a long-time peacekeeping expert, to have you here today. I haven't seen you for how long is it? 10 years?
10 years, I think, yeah.
And tell me this, after UNGA 80 a few weeks ago, who is in worse shape, us or the UN?
Well, Hugo, you look as good as ever.
You have the beautiful wife, though.
I think I have something in common with the UN, which is, just before coming here, I had my annual medical check, and I was told that I need to go on a bit of a diet to get my weight to where it should be. So obviously I came to Vienna, home of light food. But there is a similarity, because actually right now, the United Nations is going on a diet. The United Nations is going on a very severe financial diet, because the financial basis for the work of the UN really is crumbling. And I think we have to be honest about that. The UN has been having financial difficulties for some time, but this year the Trump administration's decision to freeze the majority of its funding to the World Organization really has caused a very, very significant financial meltdown. And that's true both in terms of US funding to the core UN, the UN regular budget. So far, the US has not paid a cent of its obligations for the UN regular budget or the UN peacekeeping budget this year. But it's actually also true for the humanitarian sector. Because what we have seen over the last 2 decades is really a bubble economy growing in the humanitarian sector. In 2010, overall, the UN tracked about $9 billion in humanitarian spending. Last year, it was $35 billion. And over a third of that came from the US. And that money has not dried up completely, but it has been reduced to a trickle. And so all of a sudden, the humanitarian sector that we had is having to go into very rapid retreat. And you will all have seen the stories about jobs being lost in their thousands in Geneva in particular. We are looking at a situation where the best funded humanitarian crises, I think those in Sudan and maybe Bangladesh are the best funded. But for those 2 cases, the UN has still got less than a quarter of what it needs. And in many other situations, the funding situation is worse. So the UN is going to go into a period of retrenchment. The UN is going to shrink globally. And I think the really big challenge for those of us who still care about the UN system is, how do we ensure that this is actually a well-managed diet and not just a process of forced starvation? There certainly is space, a lot of space, I think, to deal with inefficiencies around the UN. I mean, you all know that during this period of very rapid growth, we have seen a great deal of duplication in mandates, a great deal of duplication in service provision between organizations, including UNHCR and IOM. There is, I think, space to deal with that duplication. Antonio Guterres has laid out some ideas about how to start down that road. So I think we can make an opportunity out of this crisis. But I would end by saying that even if we reformed the UN perfectly, which we won't, but even if we did reform the UN perfectly, the system will be feeding fewer people. The system will be vaccinating fewer people. The system will be protecting fewer people. There is just going to be less UN out there in the wider world.
Now, I mean, obviously, IOM, UNHCR, there are vital actors in our sector, and they are, you know, the ones we think about all the time. We do work with other UN bodies as well. ICMPD is an international organization. It has UN observer status. We are also deeply invested in the fundamental ideals. It's not just about money. The UN is obviously a product of the Second World War order, and the attempt to enshrine universal human rights, that human rights are in fact universal, and that's the whole thinking behind it. It's to create a unified, United Nations based on the idea that human rights are universal. So, I mean, a very obvious question that always, you know, so the Americans have have been paying 30% of the bills, usually very late. So the first question everyone asks is, who's going to fill the gap? Who's going to fill the funding gap? Who's going to make sure UNHCR and IOM and UNDP and the World Food Programme can continue? But you know what, especially as I was listening to the previous panel, who's going to keep the ideals alive? Is China or another world power going to step in and say, yes, human rights are universal, and that's why we have, and I was listening to Madam Ambassador in the last panel, you know, actually, why do we exist? You know, we were invented to deal with the problems of displacement. But if you have a perfect UN, you shouldn't have any displacement. Okay, you might have migration. So who's going to step in to protect the ideal? And what have you been hearing in the corridors in New York when the UN people turn around and say, Europe, please save us, or who else might fill the gap?
Well, I mean, the sad reality is that nobody is stepping in at scale. And, you know, we should be honest with ourselves. If the rest of the world wanted to fill the financing gap that the US has created, it wouldn't be very difficult. We're talking about, I don't know, $15, $20 billion in total. That's real money, but it's money that could be found if there was a collective desire to address the problem. But what has been very striking throughout the last year, since President Trump's re-election, is that nobody is riding to the rescue. I mean, at the turn of the year, UN officials from across the system definitely went to the Europeans in New York and Geneva and said, in 2017 and 2018, when we had the first Trump administration, you came to our rescue, both politically and financially. And the response across the board from the Europeans so far has been, well, I'm really sorry, but there is Russia, and there is domestic spending, and we just don't have the financial bandwidth to bail out the multilateral system. Similarly, we've seen UN officials going to China or to the Chinese in New York, and they have effectively said, would you like to purchase a pre-built multilateral system? It's quite cheap, and the Chinese response has been no. China has put some additional money into some parts of the UN that it finds useful, like the World Health Organization. Chinese colleagues are talking about the fact that they need to have more top jobs in the organization if they're going to meet their own financial obligations. But Chinese friends in New York have been absolutely explicit that they are not coming in at scale. And if you look at your sector, China gave about $10 million to IOM last year. so far. China has given, I think, under 5 million to UNHCR this year. This is clearly not a sector that China is going to be investing in, I think, very strongly. So the question is, who else can lead? We have seen some movement in the last few months. Interestingly, Norway and Mexico have set up a little pioneer group of about 12 other countries involving Kenya, Indonesia. They're thinking through how to support current UN reform processes. Brazil is leaning in quite hard on the COP in Belém that's just coming up. There are signs of life. And, you know, we have seen some multilateral agreements this year. There was a pandemic treaty that was agreed after the US walked out of the room back in the spring. Some people in New York are talking about an international community -1. You know, states continuing to cooperate, sort of, and hoping that the US will re-engage further in the future. But I still don't see an alternative leader emerging. And just to answer your other question, what do people talk about in the corridors? Well, if you go to an ambassador and you say, this is a bad situation, the ambassador in New York or Geneva will say, yes, this is bad, we are not happy. But I've heard this time and again, when ambassadors call their capitals and say, we should be doing more on supporting the UN system, we should be doing more on Gaza, the response is consistently, we have higher priorities. We have to deal with the US over tariffs. We have to maintain our security guarantees with Washington. The future of the UN maybe makes the top 50 concerns in most prime ministerial and presidential offices. And so I think the UN community feels a little bit alone.
You're a peacekeeping expert, so I mean, it strikes me, looking at the difficult situation in sub-Saharan Africa, you know, my country, Ireland, we try to make our place on the world stage by saying we believe in multilateralism. You know, this was during the 50s and 60s especially. We got Indians as well, very big contributors to peacekeeping missions. Now, you've already alluded that some parts of the global south are fighting to keep the international security system alive. But you know, who will do peacekeeping missions in say, you know, the coup belt, as we call it?
You know, I think peacekeeping has been in a bit of a cyclical downturn for quite a while, and that's not actually something that's solely based on who is sitting in the White House on any given day. You know, the last time the Security Council mandated a really big multidimensional peace operation was 2014 in the Central African Republic. You know, peacekeeping has been in a process of shrinkage over the last decade, and that was going to be the case anyway. I mean, again, the financial shortfalls are impacting what the UN can do in terms of peacekeeping. The UN is currently having to repatriate, I think, about a fifth of peacekeeping forces across the board. And that will have an impact on humanitarian delivery, because as many of you know, in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, or previously in Mali, the peacekeepers provided a lot of the infrastructure, both in terms of logistics and security for humanitarian action. Again, they're just not going to be there in most cases in the foreseeable future. And I think we're moving more into a world of more ad hoc forces, sort of coalition forces of the type we see now in Haiti, probably we're going to see in Gaza before hopefully too long.
Blue helmets are part of the diet, basically.
Blue helmets are part of the diet. There's going to be more green helmet missions, and that will create some interesting circumstances because, again, UNHCR, IOM will be having to work around some fairly unpredictable coalitions of forces who may not be as used to working with the humanitarian sector as the average blue helmet mission has been.
A man I greatly admire was the second Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, who was tragically killed during the Congo crisis. And he's a beautiful book, Markings, which is one of my favorite things to read. And he's in the book, there's a great one-liner. He said, the longest journey is the journey within oneself. And in the context of the UN 80 reform proposals, which is the UN's attempt to save itself, stave off its criticisms, because as you were alluding, when they call back to the capitals, I think a lot of people in New York and Geneva are quite shocked that they are not better liked or appreciated by the states that they are serving. We have a very short timeline. I really want to get interaction with the audience, but can you give us your view on these set of proposals? What are the politics around it? What is the likelihood of these things? It's all merging all these different organizations and cutting all these jobs. Somebody said to me it might be simpler to set up a UN from scratch than do all that. I mean, what is your view?
So, UN 80 is the Secretary General's response to the financial crisis. And in the first instance, it's mainly a cost-cutting exercise. I mean, basically, Guterres is sort of cutting the UN Secretariat across the board by 20%. But it does go beyond that. Guterres has laid out a number of potential ways to make the UN system itself more efficient. The fact that the UN Secretariat organizes 27,000 meetings a year does raise the question of whether all 27,000 meetings are entirely essential. And then Guterres has also laid out some proposals for mergers of parts of the UN system. For example, merging UNDP and UNOPS, merging some of the health-related organizations. He didn't go that far on the migration and refugee file, although he has suggested that there are ways to improve IOM HCR cooperation. I mean, I think this is a start. And I think the reality is that the Secretary General only has 14 more months in office. The candidates to replace him are already sort of out there in public. Michelle Bachelet, Raphael Grossi, Rebecca Greenspan, and there are more coming.
It's interesting that people want the job.
I think it's a sign of insanity. I've said that to some of the candidates. I think you must be mad to want to run this organization, but people are narcissistic. I think if I'm going to be really honest with you, this is the beginning of a process. Guterres cannot finish it. He can just tee up some ideas. My gut feeling is that we're going to have repeated financial crises at the UN for the next 5 years, minimum. And with each recognition of the scale of the crisis, people will start to think more radically about what you have to do to maintain the multilateral system. Right now, there's still a degree of conservatism. There's still a sort of a hope that if you can just muddle through this year, that will be sufficient. But I think that 5 years down the road, if the financial situation remains this bleak, then sort of ideas for example, quasi-mergers of IOM, UNHCR, which would seem unrealistic now, will suddenly be on the table in a new, more solid way. I mean, I compare this to the recent comeback of Oasis. For many, many years, the Gallagher brothers absolutely refused to talk to each other and reunite because they hated each other. But then I think they both went through quite expensive divorces, and discovering that they had no money, they suddenly went back on tour. And when you run out of money, you actually start making decisions you otherwise would avoid, and I think that's what we will see in the UN system going forward.
Well, following that analogy, ICMPD is more like the band Blur, much more tasteful and stayed popular the whole way. But I'm really conscious, I would like to get, we wanted, by the way, were we two white Europeans talking about the multilateral system when the continent arguably most affected by that pressures in that system is Africa. I wondered if I could invite Madame El Fadil, if you don't mind, to say a few words, since you were from Sudan and a former commissioner from the African Union, although we know, of course, you're speaking just as yourself. Can we just get the microphone?
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I think the picture is gloomy. I can see that from the beginning, and there is a risk, a global risk, about our global values, about solidarity. Even when we speak about migration issues, what about the global compact on migration? What about the global compact on refugees? So the UN system is weakening. But if I speak on Africa, Africa is going to be so much affected by this cutting of aid from the United States of America. We know that they are funding IOM, they are funding UNHCR, WFP, and these 3 UN agencies are supporting Africa. There is around 17 internal conflicts in Africa. And there is UN missions in most of African countries, if not all. And they are supporting the vulnerable groups inside these countries. They are supporting on delivering humanitarian aid, and this will be widely affected. As I said yesterday, I'm living now in Egypt. I'm a migrant right now myself, and I'm supporting Sudanese refugees and migrants. Now, the cases of these migrants, when they go to UNHCR, are either delayed or rejected, not because of eligibility of the applicant, no, because of the cutting of the funds. And the same goes for IOM, these 2 main agencies, and I'm in contact of these agencies in Egypt, and I'm following up on the situation of the Sudanese refugees and migrants. Now they are releasing some of their employees. So this is going to affect the local organizations working to support these migrants and refugees living in Egypt right now, and there are large numbers, not only Sudanese, but even other nationalities. So Egypt is one of the countries that hosts millions of refugees and migrants. This is on the humanitarian side, so Africa will be affected. On the security side, the security peacekeepers, the UN security peacekeepers, who's going to fund these peacekeeping missions? So the security situation in the countries, vulnerable countries, it will also be affected. The third part that is going to be affected is development, because UN agencies that are responsible about development, like UNDP, how are going to finance their development projects in the African countries. So in this area, also Africa will be affected. In the area of democracy and human rights, every morning there is a new coup d'etat in a country in Africa, and we rely on the UN interventions, sometimes to try to get back the country into order or to bring back civilian government. So even this area is going to be affected. So what's happening in America is not an American issue. It is something that's affecting the rest of the world. Whether we like it or not, it's affecting us greatly. When I was a commissioner at the African Union, there was no direct partnership on the humanitarian issues and issues to do with migration with the United States. They were interested, especially in my portfolio. I cannot speak about the other portfolios, but in my portfolio, as someone who is responsible about health and humanitarian issues, America was most interested in the health and health security issues. And this was a direct partnership with the African Union. But the other areas in my portfolio was indirectly supporting the UN agencies. So as you said it, multilateralism is at a great risk. My hopes, as a personal hopes, that the big countries like China and other Eastern countries, Europe will come in to fill this gap. But I don't see them moving quickly to fill this gap that's going to affect our international system. I hope something will be done, or we are going to suffer a lot in Africa. And I think what we are going to do is going to look internally for other resources, internal resources. Maybe Africa will strengthen itself as a continent and look for its continental mechanisms to fill these gaps. Maybe something positive will come out of this gloomy situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your intervention. Richard, do you have any quick response to that? Or I know we're almost out of time. I was struck by, I was watching you on a podcast with James Kerr Lindsay, which is one of my favorite podcasts where I keep up with international affairs and so on. And he was all over you as the world's greatest UN expert. And he was asking exactly this: what will be the impact on the World Food Programme? There's already operational issues on the ground. You know, that the effects are already been more than keenly felt, because basically the funding cuts only really started to take proper effect in September, even though the international organizations started cutting thousands of staff. I think IOM have cut 6,000 staff, UNHCR something similar. The other ones I'm not as familiar with. But I was struck by something you said. You feel Guterres is an unlucky general. That he was also a refugee commissioner, of course, around the time, Madame El Fadil, that you were organizing the African Union, UN, EU emergency transit mechanism. And that kind of cooperation, we can't, you know, at the moment is not there. You know, we don't have the momentum for regional organizations to replace the multilateral system. And at the same time, I think even you know, I'm a Schengen expert, I believe in strong borders and all of this sort of stuff. But the EU, it probably is fooling itself if it thinks we can let the multilateral system go, we can let the World Food Programme go. We haven't even talked about Gaza, which is a whole other story. And then there'd be no irregular migration, there'd be no migration problems. So I think that it's really important that we can't afford to let it go, but the process of UN reform just seems to be indeed the longest journey, because there have been reform ideas before and, you know, they just haven't happened. And maybe you have a closing remark on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've spent 20 years of my life looking at UN reform, and I would sometimes like those 20 years back, because it's a rather frustrating business. But I would say, firstly, I do think it's not Guterres' fault that he's in his final stint in office, but I do think that when you have a new Secretary General coming in, they are going to have a de facto mandate from the member states to really think quite big about reorganizing the UN system. So I think for now we're just trying to stay afloat. But maybe if we do come back in 5 years, we'll be able to say the shock of 2025 did inspire major UN change. And if you look back over the history of the UN, there have been moments when the organization was able to reform more rapidly than at others, often in response to crisis. So I find it a little hard to think of this as a moment of opportunity, but ultimately there may be opportunities ahead to try and fix this system.
I think the UN must save itself and show signs of that before others will see, yes, okay, this is like it's like almost a company in trouble. And there was, at the time, Dag Hammarskjöld was tragically shot out of the sky during the Congo crisis. There was a famous Irish diplomat there who was actually in charge of the military operation. It's something we wouldn't really let a UN, you know, they had more power in those days. And he wrote later, he became very cynical, and he said, the function of the UN is to fail and to be seen to fail. You know, and I just think we cannot afford that kind of cynicism. And I'm really concerned about to hear this about the World Health initiatives being cut back, because that sounds so scary. So for now, it's too big a topic and we're over time, and my two Director Generals are looking at me. So I just want to thank you and thank the audience for your patience. Richard travelled all the way from New York just to be with us, so he's still actually not even on it's the middle of the night for you or something. Thank you very much, Richard, and I hope you'll stay in touch with us in the future on this important topic.
Thank you.
Thank you.